So, good evening, everyone. Welcome back to Parabellum. Colonel Stirpe will obviously speak in a moment, but before that, I wanted to explain a bit about the Fedorov issue that many people are focusing on. Now, as you know, on the channel, we've often done in-depth discussions about internal struggles, about the different views on how to conduct the war between nationalists, the more traditional army, and of course, the various perspectives on the diplomatic approach. So the domestic intelligence services, the military intelligence services, and everything else. It's quite important because Fedorov himself released a video where he talks about the reasons for his removal. And he was definitely a key element of the campaign that the Ukrainians are conducting. I haven't found these subtitles yet. I'll play it in the background just to tell you what he said. And it's quite interesting because he's not someone who beats around the bush. I mean, he speaks very directly and frankly. He says, referring to Zelensky, he offered me a position as an advisor to stay on the team, but I refused the role. I confirmed the clash with General Alexander Sisky, Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, and I attributed to him the responsibility for my removal. He says he proposed radical measures regarding personnel, including even the replacement of the commander-in-chief and the chief of staff. We have no other choice if we want to defeat the enemy asymmetrically with minimal losses by valuing competent leaders and commanders instead of sidelining them. Sisky saved our country in 2022 with successful operations, and we cannot underestimate his role. But the war has changed, says Fedorov. We haven't managed to solve the problems with mobilization and other issues without a new social pact. We sell lies, chaos, and responsibility. We need to radically change our approach. Ukrainians deserve it. The Ukrainian people didn't take to the streets for a specific minister, says Fedorov. The Ukrainian people took to the streets because the initiative on the battlefield and in the skies was seized and the trajectory changed. Ukrainians can sense when something isn't based on the values we cultivate here. Zelensky offered to keep me on the team, but since he sees it differently, I refused. But the choice, he says, has been made. The main point, in my opinion, is really cultural. Fedorov is 35 years old. He has strong Silicon Valley connections. He is definitely someone who has a vision of things that strongly clashes with a more Soviet-style vision like Sisky's, where he still wants to have control over everything. He has a privileged and personal relationship with Magyar, the one who strongly wanted this kind of operation, and they have become intertwined with each other. Further testimonies, which you will also find in the sources, mention that the old school generals would laugh at the slide presentations made by Fedorov. And in addition, there are tensions due to how the money was spent. Fedorov, of course, allocated more money to drones, and they complained that he wasn't putting money into ammunition instead, which was their favorite. So there's really a complete dichotomy in the way they approach the war, but in my opinion, it's also a matter of age. Fedorov's approach is something they just can't comprehend. So I'm bringing in Colonel Stirpe, even though there are some problems with the computer. I can't see you, Oreo. Let's see if he can make it. So basically, Fedorov is trying to use an asymmetric way of fighting the war, which is what they've come up with using drones. Meanwhile, on the other side, Sirshi had become, let's say, the spokesperson for the assault battalions. His idea was the assault battalions to invest heavily in these attack battalions. Things like that. And honestly, it's one of those resources that the Ukrainians don't have in abundance. I believe that infantry is the weakest sector in terms of manpower availability. So, in my opinion, there's a mix of perspectives and also a bit of jealousy, because in any case, this new strategy is working and it's definitely, let's say, shifting the credit towards someone new and is using new methods. He's 35 years old, so this definitely bothers some people. For military figures like Sirski, so there's this big friction between them. And reports say it was put to Zelensky as it's either me or him. This is what the Ukrainian newspapers themselves report, and so most likely Zelensky, given the difficulty of the situation, chose the one who was more expendable. That's what the Ukrainian newspapers report. General Alexander Zelensky, commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian armed forces, who had clashed with Fedorov, asked in a social media post to focus on the war and on an effective strategy. Too bad Fedorov has already found it, the effective strategy. Zelensky cited the tensions between Fedorov and Sirski as the reason for his decision to replace the Minister of Defense, stating this on Thursday at a Yuri press conference, to show that if the parties can't solve the problem, I'll have to solve it myself. On the other hand, the deputy commander of the Ukrainian Air Force resigned on Thursday in protest against the removal of Fedorov. There are also various spontaneous protests in Ukraine by ordinary people. In the meantime, well, welcome. We hope for a long time, considering the connection. Anyway, don't worry if it crashes, he'll come back. Do you think this is the same old story that we've seen repeated so many times inside Ukraine? In the sense that Sirski is always at the center of the decision-making, it's either him or Zaluzny. And the vision of the assault units for a more conservative approach, it still seems that he is Zelensky's favorite. In any case, I mean, if he has to choose between sacrificing two people, he always chooses Sirski.
Well, let's say that this reminds me of a period that's been over for more than 100 years now. But in general, this is a classic case where there are different movements and factions within the administration, both civil and military. Ukraine, and where there are rivalries. We must keep in mind that Ukraine is a young democracy at war, where there are strong personalities trying to assert themselves for both personal and patriotic reasons. Because surely most of the people involved have their own idea of how best to serve the country. In this specific case, Sirski is a representative who is, we could say, less progressive than others, a bit more conservative, and a little more nationalist than others. However, it's always difficult to try to find a label to attach to a person and to the faction aligned with that person. So, frankly, I find it difficult to comment on this specific case. Of course, as I said at the beginning, from a historical point of view, it's difficult for someone who is passionate about military history not to think back to Cadorna and to the situation in general, the General Staff and the Italian Supreme Command during the First World War. But this might not even be a fitting example because, I repeat, we only see the tip of the iceberg of these rivalries. We don't know what's underneath, so any discussion of it is highly speculative. We are witnessing a struggle more than for power, for the direction to take. The Ukrainians' will to fight is not at stake. It's a matter of how to fight, and clearly there are different ideas at play. And Zelensky has to manage it because he is the referee. He is the one responsible for the decisions, and we'll see what he does. Honestly, I have my own personal opinions, but I would rather not get into it too much out of respect for my Ukrainian colleagues who are dealing with a rather serious problem.
I, as Nadia also said, don't have any issues because I follow these events. Let's say the criticisms from Siski and so on go back to the times of Drapati, as Winter Knight rightly remembers. Drapati was another one who left his position precisely because he wanted to reform recruitment and so on, and he came into conflict with Sishi. It seems that in most matters of reform or different viewpoints, let's say about how to manage things, Sishi, for better or worse, with Zelensky backing him, he always manages to get the upper hand no matter who. Then it's not clear whether Drapati was right or not, since he wasn't able to do what he wanted. Here, perhaps the most sensitive issue is that the difference has become clear. That is, what Fedorov is doing is working. For Drapati, we didn't see demonstrations, we didn't see billboards, we didn't even see big newspaper headlines. Drapati simply said, if what I want to do isn't welcome, I'll go do something else. The bigger problem, in my opinion, is that there is objective evidence of Fedorov's actions compared to Sishi's vision. And this, in my opinion, got people moving even more because there is objective evidence. It's not really a matter of opinion whether I'm right or he's right, because it's working. So it's almost obvious to everyone that Fedorov is right. In this story,
an objective judgment is simply to say that Sisky is the conservative voice in the Ukrainian armed forces. There's no doubt about that. Then it's always difficult to say whether the conservatives or the progressives are right. It depends on the specific situations. It's like the general discussion about the novelty brought by drones. There are those who want to bet everything on drones and those who instead see them as an added capability, but not the winning weapon in itself. So, well, let's discuss this a bit. The winning weapon.
Let's discuss this, Giorgio, because yes, okay, drones are definitely the weapon that reduces losses among, definitely. The idea of Sisky's assault battalions doesn't really draw on the strength in terms of the availability of men. It's a very offensive approach, typical of Sisky since the times of Bakhmut, since the Battle of Barzeve-Ilovaisk. There's always been a very offensive approach for which he was also criticized during the times of Bakhmut. That's where he got the nickname, the Butcher. It also brings Kadona to mind a little, right? Yes, there are.
There definitely are some
things. They also call him General Iavol. I've heard some Ukrainian troops call him that. That reminds me of Keitel. No, there's the one who always says yes to the commander. The point is, okay, Fedorov's strategy is working, but does it take territory? Because I think that's the key point. Drones cause damage, drones turn off the lights, they reduce logistics and so on, but in the end, they don't actually take ground themselves. So if you focus everything on a so-called remote war, you can achieve great goals in terms of reducing popular support and to destabilize the opponent, but in the end, it's the infantryman who takes ground. And I think this is exactly what those two can't see. I don't know. We don't know if Fedorova, even through the use of drones, claims that you can win just by using drones and so on. I think that shifting all the resources to one side. In fact, part of the complaints are from the generals because it seems that he took money away from ammunition in favor of drones, which means less ground capability. Do you think this is the real conflict then about the substance of how the forces are used?
Clearly, I don't know, but let's pretend it is, and let's address this topic as you rightly suggest. So I'm speaking as an infantry officer as a premise. In the infantry, there's a widespread opinion that there are two things in the armed forces. There's the infantry, and then there's combat support. Everything else that's not infantry is support because it's there to get the infantryman to the objective. Clearly, this is a conservative opinion, I admit it. But first of all, it's also damn true for almost 10,000 years, ever since humans started fighting. It's a fact, clearly. Then you go and argue with your Air Force colleague, to whom I often say, your support, you serve me so that I can win. He will clearly have something to say about it, and I can totally understand that.
Yes, I noticed it. Everyone tends to consider their own branch as the most important one. Are you those dots down there? No, over there.
And then clearly it will be through the dialogue between him and me that we will reach the most suitable solution. For what? As far as the national interest is concerned. However, the national interest can sometimes clash a bit with the logic of One branch is seen as the core and everything else as support. For example, Italy, because of its strategic position, cannot afford to think this way. For Italy, the Navy and Air Force inevitably, at least in this historical phase, take precedence over the Army, for the simple reason that we have no enemies at our borders. Our potential enemies are far away. Therefore, they require projecting the nation's operational capabilities at a distance within the framework of alliances. And if we project forces at a distance within alliances and coalitions, we do so much more with the Navy and the Air Force than with the Army. There's no getting around it, because projecting a significant Army force 10,000 kilometers away would require Army personnel levels that we simply cannot afford. And no one, not even tries to propose that. We could project a few brigades 10,000 kilometers away. We can't project entire Army Corps, but we can project naval task forces. We can project extremely significant Air Force operational packages. So, as a rule, at the Italian level, there is a tendency to favor, in this case, what I call support, but not for Italy, for the alliance it is part of. If we talk about Ukraine, the situation changes because Ukraine doesn't have to project over long distances. Ukraine is fighting at home. So it's reasonable that there is combat support, and then there is the actual force that has to fight on the ground. But I disagree with something you said. The idea that it's about conquering territory, because this is a war of attrition, not a war of maneuver. When you're fighting a war of attrition, the fundamental thing isn't the territory, because only small amounts of territory are usually contested. We're always talking about tens of kilometers, never hundreds. And so the priority becomes destroying the enemy's capabilities and maintaining your own capabilities in order to destroy the enemy's and preserve yours. Combat support takes priority over maneuver units. And in this sense, therefore, we must prioritize everything that allows us to project firepower and maneuver activity. That is, the kinetic capability to strike the individual enemy, the single weapon system, the single adversary capability continuously, rather than being able to push our maneuver potential forward to gain ground. Because the purpose of war of attrition is to bring the adversary to collapse through loss of capability. Once the adversary no longer has the ability to control the ground, he has no choice but to leave. And at this point, the ground is recovered in a non-kinetic way.
I think this is exactly where the clash lies. In the past year, Sirski had worked to create other assault units. So he wanted to take ground unless he wanted to engage in back and forth counter assaults and things like that. While this one came up with a strategy that doesn't gain ground but causes major damage, exactly by weakening Russian capability, also by supporting certain fronts or creating crises in others, which obviously end up redirecting resources. I want to ask you this, looking at how this campaign started, why did it begin this way? At the beginning, we saw the famous attacks along the Mariupol-Melitopol highway that leads to Crimea. We saw the isolation efforts, the shaping operations. No, what they were doing was hitting the bridges to stretch this logistical line even further. But these are just layers of a bigger strategy, as we've seen. I would almost divide it into three main categories. That is, the tactical one within the first 20 or 40 kilometers, the more operational one at around 80, 100, 120 kilometers, which they did in Crimea in the corridor. And then we got to the strategic one. All of these overlapped more or less during the same period, and obviously they were all aimed at achieving something. 4 or 5 months ago, I did a live stream called Chikari the Bear, Where many OSINT analysts had noticed how the Ukrainians for 6 months had carried out a specific campaign to destroy Panzer Buk S-300, S-400 early warning systems, all in this area here. So the Zaporizhia corridor, the south of Kherson and Crimea, which obviously was the prelude to something else, because otherwise you wouldn't go and destroy something so specific unless you intend to. Now, for 2 weeks, we've seen the attack on the Sea of Azov, which also sprang up out of nowhere, right? The campaign against the ships on the Sea of Azov. In 2 weeks, I'm not the one saying this. There are all the videos, and while we're talking, if you want, I can even play them in the background. We're talking about 150 ships hit, about 120 in the Sea of Azov, and around 40 elsewhere. Even in the Black Sea, they managed to do this because they properly degraded the Russian defensive and early warning capabilities. What else can we expect? Or was this the cherry on top of a strategy?
So targeting is a military art that is quite young and has developed relatively recently. And it is based on three specific capabilities. The first is intelligence, which is the ability to identify targets. The second is the ability to calculate with meter-level precision the actual position, current position of the target. Current means that if it's a moving target, you need to know exactly at what moment it's at which point. The third skill is being able to hit that point with absolute precision. It's useless to know the exact coordinates of a point if we don't have the ability to send a delivery system to those coordinates with absolute precision. The combination of these three skills gave rise to the military art of targeting. Targeting is something that is studied and planned for the long term. We don't look for tomorrow's targets today. We have to determine the targets we need to hit today, so that it becomes easier to hit tomorrow's targets, which in turn should help us reach the targets for the day after tomorrow. In a chain, so that in 6 months we will have created the conditions to hit these other targets, which step by step have increasingly serious effects on the enemy and increasingly positive effects for us, up to the point of creating the conditions so that our famous maneuver, the one that needs to be supported, can be carried out successfully in an effective, timely manner, and if possible, at the lowest possible cost. And this is where we find that classic pairing between maneuvering capability, what we call the infantry, and all the enormous support needed to ensure that the maneuver is successful. Now, this relatively recent art, which is based on these three capabilities, it's a huge advantage Ukraine has over Russia, thanks to the capability provided by the West. In the first months of the war, within the first year, I remember that Russia had published the photo of its targeting center and published the and I'm not so much referring to the place or the systems, I'm referring to the personnel, and they took a nice group photo in front of the Russian targeting command where there were about 10 people. I still remember how much we laughed. I was already on leave while my colleagues were still serving in targeting, because that was the targeting group of mine and of the state.
I eat less than those who work for a certain person who sent me this mug under him, a mug, just 100 only to Rav.
There were just a handful of people. Now, only in the command where I worked, which was just a simple Army Corps command, there were many more of us. At the command in Ramstein, we're talking about hundreds of people. The small group of 20 Russians who handled the targeting was one thing. From our point of view, the Ukrainians have adopted NATO targeting, which is 50 years old. Thank you all. NATO targeting is done at many different levels, and we talk about layers, as you mentioned earlier. Layers in which, depending on the level we're at, tactical, operational, or strategic planning is directed at targets of different value, tactical, operational, or strategic. As you said, for example, in the Sea of Azov, first the radars and observation centers are targeted. As you said, you blind the bear. Then you target the command and control systems that manage the radars we've blinded. Then you target the anti-aircraft missile launchers. At that point, they're blind and can be hit without realizing they're about to be hit. Once the anti-aircraft capability has been reduced, you move on to target what was supporting the anti-aircraft capability, the logistics. In the case of Azov, what was the problem? Attacking the ships means that the weapons we use to strike the ships have to fly just above the water. Something that flies just above the water is easily detectable by coastal radars. That's why the coastal radars had to be eliminated. While on land, you can make a cruise missile or a drone travel along the valleys, or, for example, along a river, and the radars that are placed slightly, well, we'll get to that.
Giorgio, we'll get to that. Don't rush. We'll get to the river too.
They won't be able to see them. So in the case of the Sea of Azov, blinding and destroying the anti-aircraft defenses was particularly important. Once this objective was achieved, in relative silence, because it doesn't make much media interest if a radar is destroyed, or even if 3 are destroyed a day. But if you destroy 3 a day, and at most they can replace 1, if you do this long enough, in the end there will be very few radars left. When the air defense in the area is weakened enough, you move on to strike the real target, which in this case are the ships carrying fuel.
I'll tell you more, Giorgio. Even before the ships, the early warning, we noticed that they were focusing a lot on the barges, almost as if they had removed the obvious options available to the Russians in this situation. It's like saying we're forcing you to use the ships because we know they're particularly vulnerable. The Russians have never used the ships en masse, even though some of them are small. We're talking about ships of 20,000, 30,000, 50,000 tons. They're not the mega tankers and so on. So basically, they took away every option until they were forced to use that one. When there was, let's say, a nice basket full of eggs, by the way, the article I showed 5 or 6 months ago is this one. Notice that these are all the systems that have been destroyed. Look at where they are located and you'll already understand exactly what the intentions were. I understand that the media, who are not experts in the field, don't look that closely at certain things, but for us it was quite obvious that here in Gata Chikova something was happening. Now, however, it's the Russians who have started using these ships, which until 2 weeks ago were not being harassed. I mean, I believe that the Ukrainians already had the ability to attack them, but they chose not to do it until they did it en masse in an extremely short period of time. This is the situation as of June 30th. You can see the dots all the ships that were moving, and this is the situation as of July 12th.
Basically, they bottled them up. It's the same thing as when you force the opponent to concentrate their forces in a killing zone. They created a situation where the Russians were forced to mass deploy something that can itself be destroyed in large numbers. And that's precisely what's happening around Crimea. Still in an attempt to isolate Crimea. Now, when we broaden the discussion, Crimea is a very small part of the war, of the conflict. And I would add that from a political point of view, it is very important. But from a strictly military point of view, in a total war, the military aspect prevails over the political one. In fact, when you have to choose between a minister of defense and a commander, a chief of staff, you choose the chief of staff and sacrifice the minister of defense. That aside, Crimea, from a strictly military point of view, is not important at all. It is important politically. But militarily, no.
It was a passive front. I've said it many times. I mean, it's not like the Russians were pushing from there. The logistics behind Donetsk are much shorter. It is fundamentally important, especially for Putin. Since he took it, it was his jewel, the return. So creating this crisis that forced the Russians to use the fleet is basically bringing vulnerabilities to light. And Crimea, by its very logistical nature, has gone from being a jewel to being an Achilles' heel. But it has a political purpose more than a military one. Correct me if I'm wrong. My hypothesis was that creating all this chaos definitely has less effect militarily than it does in terms of popular support. Just look at all the videos of Russians complaining about the crisis. I believe that it erodes support for the war. And by the way, Zelensky said today that they also have to prepare because they fear that in September or October, Putin will launch another mobilization. So if I erode your support for the war and you have to make another unpopular choice, another mobilization, I'm trying to undermine your ability to carry out that further mobilization with this action. That was my theory about the real purpose of this action.
Absolutely. This is the political military level. The way you can put Putin under pressure personally in terms of his own power. On a military level, though, I see Crimea very much as a false objective. I mean, I know as Ukraine that for Russia, for my enemy, Crimea is politically crucial. I also know that it's not important from a military point of view, and I know that right now I don't have the ability to liberate Crimea. But I still direct my military capabilities against Crimea, forcing you to defend it because politically you can't accept losing it. This means that the more the Ukrainians strike Crimea, the more the Russians will have to send reinforcements. In this case, basically air defense to protect Crimea, even though Crimea is actually useless to them.
And on top of that, Moscow is also attacked because you have to defend there as well.
Considering that anti-aircraft capabilities are high-tech assets that are difficult to replace over time, much more difficult than replacing tanks. We know very well that the Russians do not produce anti-aircraft systems at the same rate as they lose them. So the more of them are destroyed, the more the Russian Federation's air defense capability is generally reduced. When I hit something that's relatively short range, which doesn't require much capability on my part in a place with little military value, so it costs me little to attack, but the enemy can't afford not to defend it. Crimea becomes a sort of black hole where Russia keeps sending its air defense assets to be destroyed for nothing. Meanwhile, everything else contracts. As you rightly pointed out, as you noticed, Moscow also serves the same function, but it's much harder to attack because it's much farther away. But we also go there from time to time.
Not to a particularly rewarding military target. It's useful because it's something the Russians have to respond to and defend. So you have two key points completely opposite from each other that they have to defend. And in the middle, there's the Azov Sea campaign, there's the campaign in the Zaporizhia corridor, there's the deep strike campaign against the refineries, and resources keep getting more and more stretched. What do you choose to defend? And to defend the political issue or the military issue? And by the way, I want to ask you, how would you defend yourself? These ships, because there's this problem, you're already short, you don't want to risk the fleet, of course. And by escorting these ships, they've created a gap. That's another thing. News just in, the Russians have stopped sending them. It's not sustainable.
They are studying what to do. Keep in mind that all these ships haven't been sunk.
No.
They have been disabled. Because according to the rules of targeting, the Ukrainians know what to hit on the ship. Let's go back to the description of how targeting takes place. I repeat, intelligence. Extremely precise identification of the target in time and place, and the ability to strike the target with absolute accuracy.
Look, let me point something out, Giorgio. Sorry to interrupt. Look, just like all ships, they get hit in exactly the same spot.
Those nodal centers that incapacitate need to be hit. The ship, there's no need to sink it. It's enough to make sure the ship can't operate for a sufficient amount of time. Clearly, they can be repaired, but what if you destroy technologically valuable components on those ships that are hard for the Russians to replace because of the embargo? With a very weak warhead causing relatively little damage to the ship. You make it unusable for many months, maybe even for years, which is the same thing we're doing to the refineries now. All of this, we'll get to that because there's a very interesting discussion to be had there too.
There's a very interesting discussion to be had about targeting refineries, as we've seen. Molto interessante sul target. It's very different from the campaigns we've seen in previous years. Before, they would hit them more or less randomly, but now there's a method to it. There is definitely artificial intelligence involved, definitely Western guidance systems, definitely reconnaissance and targeting. I mean, there must be strong English involvement in this. But it's interesting to see how, as it was already a low-cost attack, it's becoming even cheaper. With the fact that if before a drone would hit more or less a ship, sometimes it would end up on the deck and almost nothing would happen. Now they're hitting within about 1 meter. Exactly something that prevents you from using an entire ship without having to sink it completely. What else does it do? I also think it has less impact since you don't cause human casualties, which could still lead to popular support. For example, sometimes they also use obviously small boats. If you notice, they always aim more or less at the rudder. The important thing is that it can't sail anymore. There are only a few, don't expect many.
The well-known parts of the target that disable it most effectively using less force and less explosive. When you do the detailed planning for an attack, you don't just say, okay, we have to hit the ship, we have to hit the refinery. No, there are what are called the DMPIs, desired mean points of impact. Hitting the points that specifically disable the target, that do the most damage with the least effort in a more urban context. The Israelis, when they want to strike terrorists in a specific area, and they want to hit the building. Very often they don't hit the building as such, but they target the window of the apartment where the terrorist they want to strike is at that moment. Or at least they try. That's how it's done in planning. It's the exact point of impact, about the size of a window. If we're talking about a building, it's not about bringing down the whole building. If the target is a person, sometimes you want to hit the whole building. That's a different thing. It's another matter. But that's exactly what targeting capability is. To hit the spot on the ship, the window of the building, the key element of the refinery, the commander's tent at the command post. And these are all things that the Russians don't have the capability to do, and in fact, they don't do them.
You need artificial intelligence to know the routes because the anti-air units keep changing position. It's not like you always leave them the same, so you always have to study what the best approach is because they change. It's like a chessboard. That's a fundamental point of what you were saying. These are the latest OSINT analyses that show exactly where Ukrainian drones are striking the refineries. This is something you won't find anywhere else. The newspapers don't do it. They don't notice these details. The Ukrainians are systematically striking the refineries, but not randomly. They are targeting the units. LOAVID 11, 4, and 6. I'll put it simply for you, because I've spent the last 2 days talking with people who work in the field, so they could explain it to me in a simple way. They're basically special areas of the refineries where it's managed through very complicated processes. Gasoline kind of gets decanted like wine. That's where it's refined. And few Russian industries produce these parts. Actually, there are only 5. And anyway, within this large complex, there are also 2 parts that are produced almost exclusively in Europe. The Russian engineering consortia that are able to build this stuff. We're not talking about just 2 pipes or sending a team here. We're talking about if it goes under pressure, the sensors, valves, and so on will go off, and you'll have to rebuild the whole structure. And Russia has only 2 consortia capable of doing this, Nipigas and Belostroy, which have task forces. So what's the problem? They've never had to manage 30 refineries. They don't have enough qualified people on their teams to handle all this damage. And actually, what's interesting is that many of these parts are also produced partly in Russia and partly in Europe. There isn't an assembly line for this stuff, and the Ukrainians are systematically targeting exactly these parts that are highlighted. This means that the drones fly, and then with artificial intelligence in the final approach to the target, they hit exactly these parts. Which specific units? There's another fact that I think is fundamental to understanding how the fuel crisis in Russia started. How is it possible for an oil-producing country?
Can I interrupt for a moment? You said something interesting I'd like to add a point to.
Of course, of course.
They have these technical teams, which are very few, and they have to go and repair things. The targeting game also includes hitting the technologically advanced target, damaging it, waiting for the team of specialists to arrive, and then hitting again when the specialists are there, so you take them out as well.
Yes, or you make the repair useless. That's another problem they have, the redundancy of the attack. Anyway, these are not easy repairs. It's not like you just arrive and take apart some pipes and fix them. There are sensors that are produced in the West, things that need to be kept under pressure. You basically have to repressurize everything, the system, so it's very complicated. Why are they running out of gasoline? How is it possible that in Russia they're running out of gasoline when they produce 50 to 60 million barrels a month? There's a key point here, and I had this explained to me both by my collaborators and by a chemist. Gasoline, especially with additives, has a very short shelf life, in the sense that gasoline, even after just 3 to 6 months, completely loses its value. So there aren't large stocks. Gasoline has to be produced and consumed within a few weeks. You can't store it for 6 months. After 3 to 6 months, it basically loses its optimal properties and degrades quickly. It oxidizes when it comes into contact with air. Also consider that the gasoline that comes out of there has to go into trucks, and then it's unloaded into the tanks at gas stations, some of which are 30 years old. So it has a very, very short shelf life. These particular units produce the best gasoline, meaning aviation gasoline, not agricultural gasoline or diesel or those kinds of things. Here specifically, it targets something that's hard to replace, and only a few teams are capable of replacing it. And also, that this particular type of gasoline isn't the kind that's stored in large quantities, because after 3 months, it loses most of its explosive power, basically. So they specifically went to do this, and they're doing it in a scientific and methodical way. Let's go see exactly where they're going. They're hitting huge industrial complexes. The fact that the drones arrive and manage to hit exactly these stations, I'll show you the acronym because they're quite complicated. Keep in mind that the number stands for how much they can handle. If I'm not mistaken, the L, or a Helu after 11 can handle 11,800 tons. The one labeled 4 can handle 4,000. So it also gives you an idea of the volumes that are being blocked. You don't need to destroy the whole plant. If you systematically go and destroy just that part, you spend less, get the same result, and make the whole plant useless. It's a bit like if you destroy a tank's track, you have to destroy it completely. It just stays there. It can act as a bunker, but it can't do anything else. This is a very smart way to save resources, but all of this is just the rest. It's possible thanks to Starlink artificial intelligence and the intelligence support that is made available to them. And this is a problem that the Russians can't overcome. You can't quickly train people for something that takes years. Engineering to be able to fix it. On top of that, the production of components for these parts is extremely complex and really a lot. From what I've heard, it was even produced by Italian suppliers, just to give you an idea. And it's not some makeshift thing like, buying a Chinese part. You can't just assemble this with random pieces from different places. It's like trying to install one type of sensor on a car and another of a different kind. No, it all has to be the same type because there are enormous pressures. The valves have sensors. The whole system has to be pressurized. And everything, either all Chinese or all Western, you can't make Frankenstein hybrids, or all Russian. And this strategy is interesting because they've really studied it thoroughly to be able to apply it. Today, it's estimated that the Russians have gone from 4.8 million barrels to 2.8, and the attack on Omsk wasn't even included yet. Two important points I want to ask you about. First, from the point of view of the damage, it's quite repeatable. By now, they're able to hit them effectively. The Ukrainian ability to carry out a campaign that really achieves the desired pressure. Because I had noticed, and we also talked about it on the phone, that suddenly the Ukrainians had gone from about 5,000 or 5,500 drones to 11,500. So not an organic growth, as you can see, the curve, right? Both Russian and Ukrainian. I had various suspicions. And then Zelensky, little by little, let's say, he kind of cleared them up for me. One was Zelensky's immediate offer to Putin saying, we stop, you stop. And two, the announcement of a 40-day period. This means that they don't have the ability to do it for a prolonged period, but they created a special stockpile for it. That's what the data tells me, at least. I don't know if you have a different view on this.
The targeting campaign is managed in successive phases. Each time, the focus is on a different category of targets. Now, clearly, the category being focused on is refineries and oil tankers. So, in general, the availability of fuel, and specifically gasoline. And this phase clearly appears to have been planned to last 40 days. And surely a stockpile of delivery systems has been set aside, enough to allow a 40-day campaign against this type of target. It is estimated that in 40 days they will have been reduced to the desired level. Based on the planning, there is clearly already a plan for the next phase, for which a different stockpile of delivery systems will have been created. Of another kind, another batch of delivery systems to target something different but related. Since this is a strategic campaign to reduce Russia's strategic capabilities to conduct the land campaign in Ukraine and to support a large army deployed in Ukraine, it will probably still be another campaign aimed at targeting the operational logistics of the army. And here we can have fun with an agent. No, here, all right.
It's from just a few hours ago. Playlist showing the use of Lancet drones against small boats and so on, small scale stuff, meaning that we've noticed that the various campaigns being carried out use very different types of drones. Flamingos are used very little, FPVs and FP1s are used. We've seen the first drones, which are actually a bit crude jet-powered cruise missiles. The drones that are used at medium range in Zaporizhia and Crimea are of a different type. Lately, however, Lancets have appeared, which are being used, as you can see, directly against targets. You can see that's what's left, meaning that since tankers are no longer circulating, they go on the attack. So for each target, a drone is used, a drone specific. And this is it's very interesting because obviously you can't generalize. A generalization about the stock of how many they have, I did it and I admit it, my fault, it's 11,500, but that included everything. It's hard to tell how many they have to conduct one type of campaign and how many they have for another. Simply, the overall number of drones used was much more than twice the normal amount. It's also worth noting the type of targets they managed to hit. Then I'll admit it to you, this document, the refineries and all the targets, even industrial ones, because it wasn't only that one that was hit in a certain sense. I also saw an attempt to hit both the Russian space center and Russian production centers that make parts for the Iskander. So it's a bit about reducing Russia's ability to respond in the future. About Ukraine, it's not yesterday's news that they have almost run out of interceptors in Ukraine. And so a Russian response would be extremely problematic. Another thing I had hypothesized and wanted to say, if you agree, if Zelensky is now, in quotes, seeking escalation, forcing the clash, the Russian response, at a time when it's summer. And surely the damage would be the same whether it happens now or in January. Well, it's more convenient now.
Absolutely, because as we said before, the big problem for the Russians is that these three capabilities, intelligence, precision, locating the target in time and space, and the ability to strike with absolute precision, the Russians, they don't have these three capabilities, and it's not because they're bad or evil, but because they don't have access to GPS or Galileo, which are the two satellite positioning systems controlled by the West, the American GPS, the European Galileo. They have GLONASS, and GLONASS is junk. It's junk. No, again, it's not because the Russians are bad or evil, but simply because the Russians have relatively few satellites supporting it, and they've also lost the ability to launch new ones. So when the Russians can't accurately calculate, first find and then accurately calculate the position of the target in time and space, and finally the ability to launch a delivery system, the Russians have to strike exactly at that point much larger targets, which don't go after the DMPI but hit more or less the target. And this target must be in a location known before the war. because they're no longer able to find it if it was built afterwards, and they strike it with not very precise missiles. So what kind of targets are these? They can't be military targets because all the military targets move. Fixed military targets are industries, but most of the military industries have been largely rebuilt since the beginning of the war.
So many small workshops around, apart from that case of the depot. And
then they are very widespread, a bit like in Germany during the Second World War. The Ukrainian military industrial capacity is spread throughout the territory, so it's very difficult for the Russians to find. And finally, there's the problem that the missile the Russians send is not accurate at all, not because the missile isn't good, but because there isn't a satellite network to guide it precisely. So what's left? What remains are the categories of large dual-use civilian military installations that already existed before the war. Basically, the power plants hitting, which essentially affects the population, not the defense apparatus, and so basically it leaves people without heat during the... And so, as you rightly say, if it turns into a situation where I destroy your infrastructure and you destroy mine, for the Ukrainians, it's better to do it in the summer. Because the problem for the Ukrainians isn't fuel. They get fuel because we send it to them. The problem for the Ukrainians is converting fuel into energy. For the Russians, however, the problem will be different. If they reach winter with the state not having enough fuel reserves to keep the population warm, the people will be left in the cold. Even if the bombing campaign is over, you're screwed.
But by the way, you saw, right? You can't keep fuel. I mean, you can't store it for months and months and months because it loses quality, it degrades. So maybe here, not just diesel or the dirtier stuff and so on, but aviation gasoline, that gasoline, what do they use? 80, 82, 88 octane and similar fuels with additives don't work. Test it yourself, Fosco. Try it at home, put some gasoline in your car and start it again in 6 months.
And then there's another fuel we haven't talked about yet, which is gas. And gas runs through pipelines. And where are the pipelines? Out in the open. In the Great Russian Plains, everyone knows where they are. Pipelines aren't just huge tubes that never end either. They have their own distribution stations. They have their own intersections.
There's a spot, look, down in Bashkortostan where 3 or 4 pipelines intersect and it's all shaped like an X, just like when you play tic-tac-toe. Very diamond-shaped. Everything is completely visible. You just need to bring a few drones from home, set them up there and hit that spot, and you'll have an incredible effect because you block 4 production centers.
The whole campaign that the Ukrainians are carrying out now is probably terrifying the Russian Central Command in this regard. Clearly, there is almost certainly a Ukrainian plan to carry out a targeting campaign against the pipelines when winter comes. As retaliation for what happened in previous winters in Ukraine. It's easily predictable. Why aren't they doing it now?
You don't need the Madrula.
Don't you want to focus on something else? And secondly, because it's summer now. It's better to hit gas infrastructure in the winter. There's even the possibility that we've already let them know. If you hit our power plants again during the winter to try to make us freeze, we'll make you freeze too. They've probably told each other that too.
Yes, in fact, I was surprised that they hadn't hit Omsk yet. Then we have some theories about this, beyond the fact that it had to be hit because it was one of the 5 biggest and still hadn't been hit. There's a point there that I think is fundamental. Did they develop a drone capable of striking targets 2,600 kilometers away? Or did they use some of the neighboring countries?
Well, when they hit the ships in the Mediterranean, it's not like those were drones coming from Ukraine. Yes, clearly those were drones from somewhere else. And the same goes for when they hit the strategic aviation bases on the Amur and the Far East. They weren't missiles coming from Ukraine. We saw that they were drones taking off from trucks passing nearby. In the specific case of Omsk, it could have been trucks. It could have been secret agents who had set up in an ISPA in that area. Or it could simply have been that someone from a country near Omsk called Kazakhstan organized it and launched them from there. Kazakhstan, by the way, was once a satellite of Russia, but has now largely broken away to the point that it is even abandoning the Cyrillic alphabet to switch to the Latin one. Just to give you an example.
To give you another example, since the attack on Omsk happened, both they and the Azerbaijanis have made statements supporting Ukrainian independence, even saying, "We have been under Russian rule, so we understand what it means." Maybe they've turned a blind eye to certain operations that they don't see as wrong in this sense.
Very likely. And the Russian-Kazakh border is one of the longest in the world, maybe the second longest after the one between America and Canada. It's completely open. There are no mountains, nothing. It's very easy to organize in a sparsely populated area and strike from there. The Russians will say no, Kazakhstan would never dare, or if it did, it will be punished. Again, Russia right now,
Ukraine is still waiting.
It doesn't have the ability to strike anyone else. It can't even resolve things with Ukraine, let alone afford to open another front as wide as with Kazakhstan. So yes, the situation right now is definitely unpleasant for Russia.
Let's finish the technical stuff. And then I also want to talk about scenarios, what the Russians could do. Obviously, they can't replicate. They can produce drones on a larger scale than the Ukrainians. They see how it's made, but the problem is without Starlink, without artificial intelligence. Senza l'intelligenza artificiale. Not only from the point of view of analyzing the terrain to be used, but also from the point of view of the terminal approach of the drone or missile. They can't replicate this. They've never had the necessary satellite constellations to have this kind of coverage. That's one reason why even the information they had from an operational point of view was always delayed. They couldn't pinpoint the exact Ukrainian column of vehicles or hit stationary targets. The use of FABIs coincidentally hits fixed positions, a hovering target with great potential since the fixed position is known. We've seen little tactical use except when there was a drone spotting the landed Ukrainian plane and then there was the timing to launch one. An attack, however, always on very small targets. We're not talking about campaign-level operations, as we've seen. These are the points where the Flamingos struck the red crosses. The OSINT analysts noticed that, coincidentally, they're all close to this riverbed, and in fact, every time they've basically followed this, which is doable, but we've seen an epochal change recently. What am I referring to? The epochal change. If we analyze the use of the much publicized flamingos, I repeat, already in September of last year, they were saying they made 120 of them. It's clearly nonsense, but the truth is gradually emerging. And what has been noticed about this campaign compared to the previous one, both in the use of drones, meaning the ability to hit specific targets, and in ships and refineries, it has also been noticed with the flamingos. You can see in red all those that were shot down in previous attacks. And you can notice that in the last one, 3 out of 5, which is almost better than the success of all the other launches combined. Now, it's not like you suddenly got lucky, is it? Did something change with Anzara? We have our own theories. Maybe they gave her the Turcom, that is, the terrain contour matching used to follow the terrain. Maybe they managed to derive something from outside shadow because mainly their navigation relied on GPS, GNS, GNSS, that is inertial navigation. The fact that this time they came out of the river and hit a target with unprecedented precision. This is the route more or less estimated by OSINT analysts, based on videos made by the Russians where you could see them flying overhead. They followed, as usual, the riverbed, then suddenly they came out of the riverbed. To the north, you see an unnatural route, meaning you use the riverbed to avoid being seen and then emerge onto open ground to the north. The ideal route would have been direct, right? The shortest one, and that's exactly the kind of navigation we observed. We also noticed this navigation by analyzing the videos from Moscow, Ukrainian drones flying between the buildings. Navigating between the buildings means having the three-dimensional layout of the urban area of Moscow. This leap forward, let's say from a technological precision point of view, is definitely the result of a collaboration with Anthropic and Palantir, and certainly of Western concessions. To give you an idea, the 3 Flamingo drones that passed by didn't hit by chance. In fact, they hit exactly the 3 warehouses, 1, 2, and 3, exactly where they wanted to. So it's no longer about something that lands more or less in the area. It lands exactly where it's meant to. It's a bit like soccer.
But I would also add something else. There is definitely a technological improvement on the Ukrainian side thanks to Western contributions and the inventiveness of the Ukrainians themselves. There's another point related to what we discussed earlier. The Russian air defense capability is constantly being eroded. And so the more it is drawn towards Crimea, the more it is eroded in the rest of the territory. So it's not just a matter of physical destruction by the Ukrainians, it's also a matter of how the Russians manage their scarce resources for the defense of their territory. When the country's air defense capabilities are reduced, why do they focus on Crimea and the Moscow region? It automatically becomes easier to strike using increasingly sophisticated systems deep inside the territory at targets scattered throughout the area. And I would add that this also applies to the front line because the anti-aircraft resources are being pulled from there as well. And what happens when air defense capabilities along the front are reduced? What happens is that Ukrainian air capabilities can be projected further forward, and this reduces the Russian ability to carry out attacks with bombs, which in turn gives an advantage to whom? To the famous infantry. So in the end, the whole support campaign benefits the maneuver units. On the ground,
in fact, we had really noticed that the Mirage variants were starting to appear. With glide bombs, the Ukrainians were showing them. There had been the first bombardments with glide bombs, cases where there were 2 or more, enough to carry out a bombing campaign with glide bombs. Maybe not on the speed Spitburn, no. That area of Kherson pulling you out of the range of the S-300 and S-400. Or you can start using long-range missiles that begin to disrupt the actions of the Russians. It must be said that the Russians still have missiles that are capable of reaching 120, 140, and even 180 kilometers. I'm unsure how effective it will be, and we'll see that Ukrainians have already tried something similar. And they lost a couple of MiGs that had landed, so maybe the attempt and the action was still a bit premature. Certain MiGs are probably the most expendable ones. This is the famous attack with the Flamingo, which was filmed by the Russians as it came out of the riverbed. And then notice the precision of the strike. This was exactly the first of the 3. The second one will come as well. So, in my opinion, the Ukrainians did a test. There were preliminary tests. Then the Russians did well to catch these MiG-29s and hit them. So in my opinion, the activity of the action will come out slowly. Ukrainian air activity that is not strictly passive, meaning supporting the air defense. They'll probably start doing something in this regard. What's your opinion instead about the actions on this? About that isthmus, I did a live stream a couple of days ago predicting it, and the next day there was a landing with some small boats, some little robots, and so on. But the NASA firms did already 3 days before my live stream were showing a lot of activity caused by drones or Ukrainian bombings in that area. Do you think another layer of action will be harassment operations carried out by the Ukrainians with small landings?
But it still fits into the idea that the region, both Crimea and the Kherson area, the area between Crimea and the front, are killing zones. These are not areas that can be liberated by the Ukrainians in the short term. These are areas from which the Russians cannot withdraw for political reasons. And so these are areas where the Ukrainians can strike comfortably, almost undisturbed, inflicting losses, fueling low-cost attrition of Russian forces, prolonging the action over time as much as possible, because the longer the attrition lasts in Crimea and in the areas surrounding Crimea, the longer the Russians bleed without it costing too much. I don't expect an invasion or any spectacular assault operations by the Ukrainians that would lead to the liberation of territory. Not for the next 6 months.
At least also considering the experience of Kering, I wouldn't repeat it. That's also why that is not favorable terrain.
Let's also suppose that with a surprise action from the sea, the Ukrainians liberate Crimea. And then what do? They have to defend it, and they find themselves in the same situation the Russians are in today.
Worse, because they don't even have a fleet of ships.
Worse, because they don't even have the Kerch Bridge. And so it really wouldn't make sense. Crimea will be recovered when the Russians abandon it.
They will die of starvation, basically. That's the idea, right?
Exactly, from hardship, and that's why the Kerch Bridge isn't being destroyed. Because strategically it's convenient for the Ukrainians if the Russians can leave Crimea.
Mm-hmm.
It's the old idea of building a golden bridge for a retreating enemy. They're organizing themselves because they don't want to flee anymore.
Personally, I believe there's also a Western red line about not pushing things to the extreme on the bridge. Or maybe there are technical limitations. Honestly, I don't even think the Storm Shadow would be able to. The pylons are really huge. Then again, who knows? However, right now it's definitely a deliberate choice to leave it open so that people can get out. Also because it's the last alternative left. They don't have any problems with all the other bridges and they end up getting hit. I had another thought about Kinburn Spit. Small landings that still force the Russians to send men, always with the flag issue, who then end up in a territory that's basically a kill zone because it's untenable. Sometimes every month we OSINT analysts receive reports of Russians sending men and then pulling back. Because staying in this area doesn't really give you much of a chance. Just look at the area where you have to hide in a place like that. So it's almost like creating something that they have to have no choice but to defend, only to then be attacked by drones. But in any case, in my opinion, just the news of Ukrainian landings, even by small units, would create a lot of problems for Russia. Among so many other already negative news stories, even just the effect of they landed here, they caused damage there.
It's purely media driven. It's like the idea of carrying out infiltrations and showing a photo with the flag in a place that actually isn't controlled. And it's used for hybrid warfare. It's used to support a political narrative, but it doesn't lead to a military result. The Russians have put themselves in a situation where they have to undertake military operations. They support the media campaign when it should be the other way around. The media campaign should support the military maneuver, but for the Russians, it's the opposite. The military maneuver has to support the media campaign. And here we always come back to the old argument that it's not possible for the Russians to achieve a victory on the battlefield. The only thing that can be achieved is to make sure that European support for Ukraine is interrupted. For this to happen, a hybrid campaign must be launched against us, against the European population, and convince them that Ukraine cannot survive. And therefore, helping Ukraine is a waste of resources on our part.
No, but the leaves are out, Giorgio. The leaves are out. The leaves are fundamental, they tell me, for the Russian offensives. Does my audience understand it? Someone says, now that the leaves have come out, I checked the clock. In July, the leaves come out. I mean, I'd like to say, but spring in Ukraine is exactly like it is here, maybe about a month later. But it's definitely not the leaves that are a determining factor in Russian offensive operations, especially against urban environments. But, well, what can we do about it? That's how it is.
Speaking of seasons, when we talked on the phone this morning, I told you that here it was 16 degrees. Then my wife arrived, the one who brought me the pizza, and she said, look, it's only 11 degrees.
Today it's a bit chilly. Where I live, it's 24, 26, 27 degrees, it depends. I'm a bit high up, 580 meters, so it's pretty cool in my area. But trust me, in 10 years, we'll talk again about certain choices. Final question. The Russians are starting to realize this. I follow Russian military bloggers a lot, both the half-crazy ones and the more serious ones. They're realizing that this Ukrainian strategy can't be replicated by them, that just defending isn't really a strategy because inevitably you're trying to defend a huge country. And so the choices you have and the resources available aren't enough, plus it's a passive choice. And the other thing is, how do you stop Ukrainian production? Because most of it is assembled in Ukraine and so on, but it depends on Western support and partly on production that's spread out across Ukraine. Various Western countries expanding to other countries would be suicide unless it's a bluff. I studied game theory, you know. What would have been the riskiest scenario for Putin, the one that could cost him the most or be completely destructive? Do you know what it was? An attack on NATO? Because if many countries literally crap themselves, the whole thing falls apart. But if he makes a mistake and everyone bands together, that's practically a destructive scenario for Russia. So it's an all-in, a do-or-die situation. It's the only thing that could stop support for Ukraine. There's an internal fracture, an escalate to de-escalate move at maximum risk, with either maximum destruction or maximum payoff in that case. If countries like Italy maybe say, no, we won't get involved in a direct war, my theory is that a fracture of this kind won't happen. Surely there would be countries that would withdraw, like Italy from my point of view, but in my opinion, there would also be countries that would seize the opportunity, like Poland, the Baltics, the Nordics, and so on. So maybe you would have fewer countries involved, but they would be fully committed, not just giving a tiny bit. But they talk about it in Russia. We often watch Russian TV, and everything that airs on Russian TV is all programmed. Everything that is said for a reason. They're seriously talking over there about reaching this kind of escalation also because how are they supposed to stop this Ukrainian campaign?
So it's true that they talk about it, and there's definitely a push to do something stupid. They talk almost every day, too. To go and destroy Moscow and London with nuclear weapons, or Paris or Berlin. They haven't talked about Rome yet.
To sink England.
Will we get there? No, it would never work here. We would need to have a whole big discussion about how NATO's deterrence works. No one could pull back, not even Italy, for a very simple reason. The forces of the various nations are deliberately spread out along the entire potential front. Wherever the Russians went to attack as a provocation in an attempt to create a political fracture within NATO, they would inevitably end up hitting Canadians,
Germans,
from all the European nations that would already be there. For any government, withdrawing after its soldiers have already entered combat would be a very difficult thing politically, political suicide. Because the government, let's say Italy, regardless of who is in power, because it wouldn't change, it would be the same thing. It could be the Conte government, it could be the government, even Menacci, it wouldn't change anything. At the moment Italian soldiers were involved in combat, NATO activated Article 5. Operational planning is underway and I'm withdrawing. Now, what are the political consequences? First of all, NATO wins because there is no possibility for Russia to win a conventional conflict with NATO, especially in the current situation. And after that, we end up with a Russia that cannot be grateful to us for not having gotten involved. And all the others who won the war on their own, who look at us with, and where were you? What head of government would want to find himself in such a situation, isolated from the rest of the world?
I know I'm the one who's pessimistic. I don't trust that much. I don't trust Italy or other countries that much.
It couldn't happen in Italy regarding nuclear exchange.
I don't know what the doctrine is. We've already warned them, if you drop it, we'll drop it right away. So there's always this story that they'll fire, etc.
We've already warned them, if they dare to use nuclear weapons, the response will be automatic. And this applies to nuclear weapons, but also to conventional ones. There's no way to back out once the conflict has started, only before. But things have been deployed, put on the ground, in the field in such a way that it's not possible. There is no beforehand. They have to attack by surprise. If they attack by surprise, there's no time to talk beforehand. And once they've attacked, we're already here fighting. You can't disengage anymore. It's practically impossible.
Let me play devil's advocate.
So even these guys couldn't do what they can do. What can the Russians do? What can they do?
What can they do if they can't use this strategy?
Now, since at the end of the day, even if I speak badly about them, because right now they are also my enemies, the Russians are, they're soldiers, capable, tough, and resourceful. The way I imagine it right now, they are working like crazy to find a technical solution to the problem of deep penetrations and attacks on Russian territory. What could be a technical solution within Russia's reach, not so much technologically, but especially industrially. A solution that is the same thing we are looking for right now, an economical system that can be easily mass-produced to shoot down drones. And here we can get creative because there are proposals.
I've got one too.
Maybe there are infinite ones.
The big guns that launch foldable drones, which open up in flight and go after other drones. The problem is, yes, but you have to place a man with the big gun every 3 or 4 kilometers, and you need a lot of luck. I mean, it's a point defense.
Basically, it's one of the possible solutions. There could be others. I'm an infantry officer. I'm not an engineer. I can't imagine this solution, but surely it exists because there's no weapon against which there is no shield. And the problem is simply to find the shield.
It's a decentralized attack, and you want to centralize a defense, but instead it's a decentralized attack, decentralized defense, or one that adapts depending on the situation, that's very mobile, very adaptable, and so on. In the end, maybe the best solution is actually drones that directly patrol the area.
But it has to be something that can be deployed along the front line or just behind the front line, because that's the only way. Because anything the Ukrainians fire at Russia has to go over the front. And the Russians need to have something that allows them right behind the front to respond, to intercept everything small and light that the Ukrainians send over the front toward Russian territory. And they can be new and innovative light anti-aircraft systems. They can be snipers. They can be electronic jamming systems that I can't even imagine. They are definitely working on it, and it has to be a centralized effort. There can't be many projects. It has to be just one, because that's what the Russians know how to do. To pool resources and focus nationally on that asset, and thanks to that, be able to produce it in large quantities. I think they're doing this because it's the only option.
They'll ask the Chinese, the only ones who can provide satellite coverage and AI technology. The Russians don't exist. I mean, they really don't exist. They're not on the radar. So in this sense, the only ones who can really help them in this regard. From an analytical standpoint, you can use AI to analyze how far Ukrainian drones might reach and which route they take. On one hand, it analyzes what the best route is based on the positions of my defenses, and on the other, it tries to figure out based on the positions of my defenses which route you will take. And this way, you can better rationalize your resources. They don't have these things, they're completely lacking.
They could try to get them from the Chinese, and oh God, they could even try to get them from someone else. Because here we're also talking about private companies, and private companies all over the world are sensitive to the economy. Someone who's paid well enough might also do it. Agree to cooperate? They're definitely working on that too.
Thank you. Then last one, really, to the soldier, that they are not able to have an immediate answer. And we know more or less that the Ukrainians in any case cannot carry out this campaign in the long term. Do you really think that in September, October, Putin will call for mobilization? Because I don't see any great solutions. Even just taking the Donbass, honestly, the date they've set for themselves, November 15th, it's probably more likely that Elon Musk will get to Mars before they take the Donbass on November 15th. There's no way out. I mean, the Ukrainian strategy, as effective as it is, still isn't a strategy that guarantees you a victory. You can weaken their support, cause issues, and more. But if the other side doesn't give up, because the Russians are also quite famous for gritting their teeth and maybe finding an answer a year later, I don't see a military solution. I don't think the two forces in the field have the ability to achieve their objectives.
Even if he recruits 500,000, it's not a conflict that can be won by military maneuver. It's a conflict that can at most be won by attrition. When the resources of one of the two sides, of one of the two opponents, are eroded to the point that they can no longer even maintain the current situation on the ground, when one of the two armies no longer receives fuel, no longer receives ammunition, no longer receives reinforcements, at that point, simply the soldiers will start going home. It's a conflict, yes. And that's what happened in 1917 to the Russian army. They simply left.
I've noticed this, Giorgio, right? Both strategies, for better or worse, aim to erode popular support. The Russians do it in a clumsier way, that is, sending them out into the cold, hoping this will break the Ukrainian will. What I've noticed instead about the Russian response, because it must be said, after all, Putin had managed for 4 years to keep Russians from feeling the war. It was a bit like the Afghanistan effect for us, right? Or Iraq, it was a distant war. It didn't affect us. The response I've seen from many Russians to the crises, which are still minimal compared to what was happening to Ukrainians, has been quite hysterical, also because they're not used to it. I believe that Ukrainians had 4.5 years to literally get used to misery and living in terror, while for Russians it's happening now. They didn't have that period of adjustment. It hits them all at once. It's not gradual, it's a sudden blow, and it's not certain that the population will be able to handle it, also because it's a very personal matter. The idea that Russia has of itself, that Russians have of themselves, of who leads them, of who holds power. I notice that everyone criticizes, but no one has the courage to talk about Putin himself. People always criticize, but whose fault is it when it comes to air defense? Why is no one held accountable and things like that? Yes, people look around but never look up. I've noticed this in the blogosphere as well.
But the resilience of the Russian people is rock solid in the sense that they find it easier to close their eyes and not look. Not accepting that they've gotten everything wrong. So they bury their heads in the sand, say they trust the boss and wait. They wait until someone lights a fire under them. Granite-like resistance, which is special because granite can withstand extremely strong compression. Then suddenly it explodes, it crumbles all at once. And this is the risk of social collapse. Social collapse of Russia, which frankly terrifies me. Not because I'm afraid of nuclear holocaust. I'm not even afraid that Russian bombs will end up in the hands of terrorists. I'm afraid of hordes of hungry Russians pouring into our country because they're starving.
We would have two countries in complete crisis, Russia and Ukraine. I mean, together, that's 180 million people. They're not easy to handle. We've already seen Russia in the 90s. And in my opinion, they would also drag Belarus along with them because it's economically connected anyway.
Absolutely.
Etc.
So frankly, I hope that before the Russian population wakes up and does something stupid, the Russian oligarchs wake up. That they realize that if we don't do something here, we lose everything. I hope for a palace coup.
Thank you. It's most likely that something will happen internally. I'm telling you, lately they're coming out. Besides the fact that everyone comments much more freely, the criticisms are, I don't treat them as absolute. The other day, a Russian journalist literally said, Putin must resign. I mean, unthinkable. If someone had said that months ago, they would have been thrown out the window. The military bloggers themselves who analyze the situation say, we're not getting anywhere, even if we want to recruit another 500,000 men, because that's the number. They're also talking about wanting to recruit more. Even if, how many men do we want to spend to take Hill 243? How much do we want to spend to take the Donbass? And when we've taken it at the cost of another 500,000 casualties, wounded, dead, and so on, what have we solved? They themselves say this. I've shown it to you in previous live streams. We take it, we spend another 500,000. Do you think the Ukrainians will give up, that they'll surrender because we've taken Kramatorsk and Slovyansk? Can't they find a solution? It feels like we're just continuing for no reason, because there isn't a real solution and no one has the courage to stop this avalanche that's happening. The clinicians aren't able to stop it. At best, they can try to throw a wrench in the works. The Russian machine and the Russians themselves keep going almost out of inertia, almost because we're already in it now. And no one at a high level has the courage to say, okay, it was a mistake, let's stop.
No solution. In fact, as things stand right now, my answer to your question is that Putin absolutely has to do something, because otherwise the feeling is that he no longer has his hands on the wheel. So he is the autocrat. He has to come up with a solution.
I'm afraid it's a major mobilization.
The only thing he can do is this so-called mobilization, a mobilization that in practice isn't much. It wouldn't lead to much. Because apart from further taking away manpower from industrial production and creating a bottleneck in the territorial training organization of the army, it's not like it will do much, because the number of soldiers that can be logistically supported at the front is fixed. You can't send more than that. You will have more reinforcements available, and in theory, you could go back to human wave attacks. But we've seen that these human waves end up clashing against the famous drone wall. If they don't find a solution to shoot down many drones along the front line, even having 500,000 reinforcements available won't be a solution. Putin's problem will be that if he carries out the mobilization in the fall, right when it starts to get cold, and the Ukrainians manage to make it so that this year it's the Russians who suffer from the cold, this could be the moment when, as you were saying, the Russian, surprised with his backside burning, even though he had buried his head in the sand, lashes out and does something. Thank you. Thank you. Something stupid.
I would say, yes, that's what we're all following a bit, but also certain moves, right? Internet blocks, VPNs, this and that, they're all moves that are aimed at controlling public opinion, let's say reducing the control that the military, bloggers, and so on have over communication regarding the war, since they've become more and more critical and so on. And we all noticed that inevitably Peskov also changes his terminology. Lately, he came out saying, this is a war, not a special operation, which is also a way to prepare public opinion for further, let's say, decisions and so on. And lately, there's talk about a return to expansion and mobilization. Pretty much everyone expects it to come out, so you can also understand the timing of the Ukrainian attack, aimed also at eroding part of the support in order to, let's say, reduce Putin's ability to make and impose such choices. Pretty much everyone expects it, both inside Russia and outside, and probably the Russians are famous for doubling down. They don't really take a step back. If there's a mistake, we rather double it because we haven't made enough of them. For all the pain in the necks, I see people saying, oh, Russia is collapsing here and there. No, we're basically saying that with the introduction of drones, with the new strategies being applied, it's not even a matter of numbers anymore. It's not 1 million soldiers or 500,000 soldiers that allows you to conquer Ukraine. They're technological solutions, less expensive, more remote, rather than having men on the ground. I don't think the Russians have the popular will or the stomach for more years of war, and I don't think the Ukrainians have the manpower to regain ground, so the best thing is to make the ground collapse under the opponent. A year ago, people were talking about strategic nullification. I can't achieve my goals, so I make sure you don't achieve yours either. What do we want to do? Do we want to keep going like this? In my opinion, that's the better strategy, you know? By contrast, I favored an offensive strategy in 2023. I thought that a defensive approach was the wisest thing, but this new idea with the drones, I hope that Zelensky hasn't caused any problems with this choice between Sishy and Fedorov, because they had for sure found the key to succeeding. Not to win the war, but to prevent the Russians from continuing theirs, which in my opinion was the most important key. Because then acceptance comes first to the people before the leaders. I think we've said everything. You will find a list of sources below, including the paper, if you want to analyze, even from an economic and mathematical point of view, the damage suffered by the Russian system. Follow the Colonel and me as we keep discussing the war and see whether either side finds other ways to break the stalemate. The Black Swan is still our previous live with Capitini and Moro. Ukraine's reliance on outside forces, which may change in the next 2 years. Thank you. Which I absolutely do not trust. I mean, parties in England, the Tellon of Frontoy, the Landel and Pen in France. Which, in my opinion, is one of the factors that probably leads Putin to choose to continue it. More or less, let's say, fumbling toward the Donbass, hoping that the political balance in Europe will change and that this change will be more favorable for him and less for... Thank you. I have to thank everyone. The political balance in Europe will change and that this change will be more favorable for him and less for Ukraine. I don't know if you want to say anything else in closing. No, and I confirm that in closing. Thank you. Look, Putin is not Kramatorsk.
Everyone too, let's mobilize. Thank you, everyone. Just to ensure the army gets the necessary reinforcements to continue the assaults toward Kramatorsk, which end, as we have seen. His real strategic goal is to separate Europe from Ukraine. To separate Europe from Ukraine, he needs to wage a hybrid war, scare the population, convince the governments of the uselessness of supporting Ukraine and that it's not in anyone's interest to support Ukraine. So to vote for those parties that tend to change the policies. Then I noticed, Giorgio, an intensification of this rhetoric in addition to attacks that have happened to me.
That famous one from Roskomnadzor and things like that. I noticed that in the last 8 or 9 months, this thing has intensified a lot. And I also see it from the behavior of those who are pro. That thing there has also become rougher. Yes. More aggressive, cruder, and it has become much less sophisticated.
Attacks. Thank you all. Rougher.
Yes, more aggressive, rougher.
It has become much less sophisticated.
Focused on certain people who still support Ukraine. I've noticed it everywhere. The guy I know who used to do portraits, who was killed in Poland, murdered, etc. Yes, it also shows how much influence one guy could have. He used to paint pictures like that. Not much, I noticed. Thank you all. Have a good dinner. Many thanks to Colonel Stirpe, and we'll see each other. We'll already be watching with pizza in front of everyone. I want to watch the matches, the semi-final and the final.
So thank you all.
Thank you, President Madaluno, for a new country profile, geopolitics, history, and culture. Thank you all. Hi, Mirko. Good evening, everyone.
Hi, Mirko. Good evening, everyone.